My grandmother owned 3 restaurants. When she died, she left all 3 of them to my aunt. She left me a cookbook. That's the version of the story everyone in my family heard at the reading of the will, and not a single person questioned it. My aunt had been managing the restaurants for nearly 3 years by then, ever since my grandmother's health started failing, and the logic held together cleanly enough that no one looked too hard at it. Keep the business with the person already running it. My father squeezed my hand under the table when the attorney read that part. He didn't say anything. He knew better than most that my grandmother's decisions rarely required explanation, and that asking for one usually meant you weren't ready to hear the answer. The cookbook was blue. Faded cloth cover, the kind that used to sit on the shelf above the prep station, at the original location on Vine Street in Franklin, Tennessee. My grandmother had 3 of them she never let anyone touch. She used to say they were her backups, that everything important got written down twice, once in her head and once in the book. My mother used to roll her eyes at that. My mother, who had spent more hours in those kitchens than anyone, who could recite every recipe from memory and never once thought to write any of them down. My mother died 3 years before my grandmother did. Breast cancer, stage 4, diagnosed in October and gone by the following March. It was the kind of loss that doesn't just take the person, it takes the shape of everything that came after. My grandmother was never quite the same. She kept the restaurants running, but something in her had gone quiet in a way none of us knew how to reach. I watched it happen slowly over those 3 years, and told myself she was grieving, which was true, and told myself there was nothing else underneath it, which was not. I took the cookbook home the afternoon of the will reading and set it on my kitchen table and didn't open it for almost a week. There was no particular reason for the delay. I think I just wasn't ready for it to be empty, and as long as I hadn't opened it, it could still be something. When I finally sat down with it on a Thursday night, I found a USB drive taped to the inside back cover with a strip of medical tape, and beneath it, in my grandmother's handwriting, small and precise, the way she wrote everything, a note that said, "For Callie only. Everything is in here. You'll know what to do with it." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't excitement or clarity or the particular kind of righteous energy you see in the version of this story people tell at parties. It was something closer to dread. The specific dread that arrives when you understand you've been handed something you didn't ask for and can't put back. To understand what was on that drive, you have to understand who my grandmother was, and who the family had quietly allowed her to become in the final years of her life. Opal Dean Whitcomb opened her first restaurant in 1978 in Franklin, Tennessee, with a borrowed $8,000, a 6-burner stove she bought secondhand from a hotel that was closing, and a menu she wrote on the back of a paper grocery bag. She called it Opal's Kitchen because she didn't have a better name, and because her landlord told her she needed one before he'd sign the lease. She worked the kitchen herself for the first 4 years, breakfast and lunch service only, no dinner, because she was also raising 2 daughters alone after my grandfather left. The restaurant became something real because she made it something real. 1 plate of biscuits and gravy at a time, 1 early morning and 1 late night at a time, for years before anyone outside of Franklin County knew it existed. By the time I was born, there were 2 locations. By the time I graduated high school, there were 3. It was never a chain in the way you'd recognize. No matching uniforms, no corporate signage, no laminated table tents advertising limited-time offers. It was 3 buildings in 3 parts of the same county that had been serving the same food the same way, since before most of the staff had been born. People drove past closer options to eat there, and my grandmother never once thought that was unusual. My mother was the one who kept the kitchens alive. She managed the original Vine Street location for 15 years, and knew every supplier, every regular, every trick for keeping the walk-in cold when the compressor ran hot in July. She was the one who could taste a pot of gravy and know exactly what it was missing without having to think about it. When she died, the kitchens kept going, but the way a car keeps going when you take your foot off the gas. By momentum, not intention. My aunt, Rhonda, was my grandmother's younger daughter. She and my mother had never been close in the way that made for easy comparisons. Rhonda had spent most of her years in the business managing the front of house, schedules, vendor invoices, catering bookings, the administrative layer that my mother had always been grateful to hand off. When my grandmother's health started declining after a series of small strokes across about 18 months, nothing dramatic individually, just a slow and steady dimming, Rhonda stepped into the full management role with a practicality that everyone in the family read as loyalty, including me. I want to be clear about that, including me. My grandmother moved into Rhonda's house during the last year and a half of her life. I visited on Sundays when I could, driving down from Nashville, usually arriving around noon and leaving by 4. She was sharp most days, quieter than she used to be, but sharp. She asked about my job. I do bookkeeping for a small manufacturing company. Nothing glamorous, but I know how to read a ledger, and I know what numbers look like when they're telling you something you don't want to hear. She asked about my father. She asked about the weather in Nashville, as though it might be different from the weather in Franklin, 20 miles south. She did not talk about the restaurants the way she used to. I told myself that was grief. That she was still working through losing my mother, that it was natural for a woman in her 80s to loosen her grip on the things she'd held tightly for 40 years. I was watching someone I loved get smaller, and I focused on what was in front of me, and I let the missing conversation stay missing. She noticed things I wasn't noticing, she just didn't tell me. Not yet. The USB drive contained 3 folders. The first held scanned copies of invoices, 26 months worth, from a company called Magnolia Event Services. The invoices were for catering, private dining bookings, staff appreciation events, a series of holiday spreads that had apparently been hosted at all 3 locations annually. The amounts per invoice were not outrageous individually, but when I added them across 26 months, the total came to just over $194,000 billed to Opal's kitchen by a single outside vendor. The second folder held the business registration documents for Magnolia Event Services, pulled from the Tennessee Secretary of State's database. The registered owner was my aunt's husband, Keith. The third folder was a video file, 11 minutes and 40 seconds. My grandmother had recorded herself on an iPad, sitting at the desk in Rhonda's guest bedroom, a lamp positioned so her face was clearly lit, the way someone would set up a shot if they had thought carefully about being believed. She was wearing the gray cardigan she wore when she meant business. She spoke without notes, without hesitating, without repeating herself. She explained that she had first noticed the Magnolia Event Services invoices, approximately 2.5 years earlier, while reviewing a stack of mail Rhonda had set out for her to sign. She recognized the billing address immediately. It was Keith's home address, the same one she'd mailed Christmas cards to for 9 years. She didn't say anything to Rhonda. Instead, she started paying attention. Over the following months, she began pulling invoices from the filing cabinet in Rhonda's home office, 1 or 2 at a time, on evenings when Rhonda and Keith were out. She would bring them to her primary care appointments and ask Della, the receptionist who had worked at that office for 30 years, to scan them on the office machine. Della asked no questions. My grandmother brought cookies. What she found, beyond the Magnolia Event Services billing, was a second company, Magnolia Supply Co., registered at the same address, also owned by Keith, also appearing on the restaurant vendor list, this time for produce and dry goods. She had kept records of what she used to pay her actual suppliers before Rhonda took over full management. The markups from Keith's supply company ranged between 60 and 110% above what she had previously paid for comparable products. Over approximately 3 years of dual billing, services and supplies, she had estimated the total diverted from her restaurants at somewhere between $310,000 and $350,000. She ended the video by folding her hands on the desk in front of her, looking directly into the camera, and saying, "I am not taking this to a lawyer yet, because I don't trust that Rhonda won't find out before I'm ready. I am putting it in Callie's hands because her mother always told me she was the one who noticed things. When she was 12 years old, she told me there was an error in the electric bill. I checked and she was right, and I gave her $1 and said good eyes, and she looked embarrassed, the way she always did when she was proud of something. I don't have her mother's fight left in me, but I think Callie does. I hope she does. If you're watching this, Callie, that means I decided you did." I watched it 4 times. The 4th time I had a legal pad on my knee, and I was writing down every name, every company, every number she mentioned, in the same small, precise handwriting she had used on the note under the drive, as if something of how she thought might transfer through the pen. I didn't call anyone for 2 weeks. I understand why the version of this story where I act immediately is more satisfying to tell. It moves faster. It has the clean momentum of someone who knows what they know and does what needs to be done. But the reality is that I spent 2 weeks going to work, cooking dinner, calling my father on Sunday evenings, and saying nothing about any of it to anyone. I was trying to understand what I actually had before I decided what to do with it. What I had was a home video recorded by a grieving 81-year-old woman and a collection of scanned documents I had not yet verified against any independent source. Rhonda had 3 years of management authority. She had the relationships with the current staff. She had physical possession of all 3 locations and all of the working financial records. If I moved too fast with evidence that wasn't airtight, she would have time to explain it, to characterize me as someone who had found documents she didn't understand, and built a grievance around them. She would be able to cast the whole thing as a family dispute over an inheritance, which is exactly the framing that makes financial investigators politely decline to get involved. I thought about what my grandmother had said, that she had watched and documented for 2.5 years without saying a word. I had spent my whole life thinking her patience was stubbornness, or maybe resignation. I was starting to understand it was strategy. A lawyer friend of mine gave me a name quietly, the way you give a name when you want someone to actually use it. Yolanda ran a small forensic accounting practice out of an office in Brentwood. She specialized in exactly the kind of situation I was sitting in the middle of. We met on a Tuesday evening after her regular business hours, and I brought the blue cookbook and the USB drive and my legal pad. And by the end of 2 hours, she had watched the video twice, read through my notes, and said, "Okay, let's go through everything." We met twice a week for 3 months. We went through the Magnolia invoices against regional vendor rate comparisons Yolanda sourced from industry databases. We pulled Keith's 2 LLCs from the Tennessee Business Registration records and confirmed that they shared not just an address, but a registered agent and a phone number that traced back to Keith's personal cell. We pulled the publicly available financials for Opal's Kitchen. The business had been structured as a multi-member LLC, and certain filings were accessible through state records, and compared the expense line items to what my grandmother had recorded in her scans. Yolanda was precise in a way that steadied me. She didn't tell me what to feel about any of it. She told me what the numbers said, and then what they meant within the specific legal framework of Tennessee fiduciary law as it applied to a business manager operating under an informal but documented authority arrangement. She also told me something I hadn't known. Rhonda was in active negotiations to sell the Vine Street location, my grandmother's original restaurant, the one with the hand-lettered chalkboard, to a regional hospitality group out of Chattanooga. Any acquisition of that size would require a due diligence audit, standard practice. A third-party firm would go through the books independently. I understood immediately what that meant, because I had spent 3 months staring at what those books contained. A third-party auditor would find the Magnolia vendor relationships. They would flag the rates, the ownership connection, the volume and consistency of payments to a company owned by the sitting manager's husband. And when they flagged it, my evidence would not read like a niece with a grudge. It would read like confirmation of what an independent financial review was already finding on its own. I waited for the sale to close. It closed on a Thursday in late April. My father called me that evening. He'd heard through a cousin, and his voice had a tone I recognized. Not quite grief, but adjacent to it. My grandmother had opened that location before my parents ever went on their first date. He'd proposed to my mother in the corner booth. I told him I had some things to take care of and that I would call him on Sunday. I kept my voice even. I'd gotten better at that over the previous 3 months. The due diligence audit started the following Tuesday. By Thursday of the same week, I had appointments with the estate attorney and with the commercial litigation attorney Yolanda had referred me to, a woman named Bet Loring, who communicated in short sentences and had a talent for making complicated financial arrangements sound exactly as deliberate as they were. I brought a binder Yolanda had assembled, 37 pages, tabbed and indexed, with a 2-page summary at the front that made the pattern visible to anyone willing to read it. The estate attorney read without speaking. When he finished, he set the binder down and was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then he said, "Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing." I will not pretend the weeks that followed were dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no confrontations in parking lots. There were no phones thrown or voices raised in the attorney's office. What happened was slower and in some ways more difficult to witness. The machinery of legal accountability moving at the pace it actually moves, which is methodical and unseated by emotion and impervious to how urgently anyone feels about the outcome. The due diligence auditors flagged the Magnolia vendor relationships on day 4 of their review. The acquisition was placed on hold pending clarification of the vendor relationships and ownership disclosures. The estate attorney called an emergency meeting of Opal's Kitchen's operating members. 3 people, it turned out, including my father, who had been added to the LLC documents years earlier by my grandmother, quietly, in the way she did most of the things that mattered. My aunt walked into that meeting not knowing I would be there. I was already seated when she arrived. Yolanda was beside me. My father was across the table. Rhonda looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she sat down and looked at the estate attorney instead, which I understood was a decision. Yolanda presented the findings. She was unemotional and thorough and had no personal history with anyone in that room, which meant no one could frame what she was saying as anything other than what it was. When she finished, my aunt said that the arrangements with Keith's companies had been disclosed to my grandmother verbally, that my grandmother had approved them, that the rates reflected a premium for reliability and relationship. The estate attorney asked, very calmly, if she could provide that verbal approval in any documented form by the end of the following week. She never did. I don't believe it existed. Rhonda was removed from management within 3 weeks, pending the outcome of a civil suit filed by the estate against Magnolia Event Services and Magnolia Supply Co. Keith retained separate counsel. The Vine Street sale was voided. The remaining 2 locations were placed under interim management. A man named Dennis, who had been the general manager at the Gallatin Road location for 11 years, and who, Yolanda noted during one of our later meetings, had been quietly documenting his own concerns about the vendor rates for over a year and simply hadn't known who to take them to. He had been keeping the restaurant solvent the same way my grandmother had been keeping her records, without acknowledgement, without support, because the alternative was worse. I did not hear from my aunt for almost 2 months. When she finally called, it was a Saturday morning in late summer. I was in my kitchen making coffee. She didn't open with an apology. She said, "You could have come to me first." I held the phone and looked out the window at the oak tree in my neighbor's yard, full and still in the August heat, and I said, "So could she." There was a silence on the line. "She knew things weren't going well for Keith," my aunt said. Her voice was different than it had been in that conference room. Something had come out of it. She would have helped if I'd asked. She always helped. I thought about the video, the gray cardigan, the lamp angled carefully, the 11 minutes my grandmother had spent making herself understood to someone she wasn't yet certain would find it, against the possibility that no one would. I thought about the Sunday visits and the questions about my job and the conversations that had always felt slightly incomplete in ways I hadn't been able to name. I said, "She did help you. For almost 3 years, she watched what was happening, and she didn't go to anyone because you were her daughter and she was living in your house. She was afraid, and she didn't have anywhere else to be, so she wrote it down instead. That's not permission, that's someone who's out of options." The line was quiet for a long time. "She loved me," my aunt said finally, and her voice had broken somewhere in those 4 words, just slightly, just enough. "She did," I said. "That's not the same thing as what you're describing." I didn't say anything else, neither did she. The call ended. The civil suit settled the following spring. Between frozen accounts connected to Keith's 2 LLCs and a forced liquidation of certain business assets, approximately $284,000 was recovered. Not the full amount my grandmother had estimated, but most of it. The Tennessee Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division had opened a separate inquiry after the suit became public record, which added a dimension Keith's attorneys hadn't fully anticipated and which became part of the settlement terms. The Vine Street acquisition fell through entirely once the litigation became visible, which meant the original location, the one with the hand-lettered chalkboard menu and the corner booth where my parents had their first date, remained part of the Opal's Kitchen estate. Dennis took over permanent management of all 3 locations under a new operating agreement. He was fair and precise and had, I learned later, paid for a walk-in compressor replacement out of his own pocket 2 years earlier, because he hadn't wanted to put a large repair request in front of Rhonda and draw attention to his own bookkeeping of the issue. He was exactly the kind of person my grandmother would have trusted, if she'd had the chance to make that call herself. My father walked into the Vine Street location about a month after the settlement, without telling anyone he was going. Dennis called me afterward to let me know. He said my father had sat in the corner booth for almost an hour with a cup of coffee, and that Dennis had left him alone, which was the only correct thing to do. I went the following weekend. The dining room looked the same booths, same ceiling fans turning slowly, same chalkboard above the counter with the daily specials in chalk that Dennis's wife turned out to have a talent for lettering. Near the entrance, someone had hung a photograph I hadn't seen there before. My grandmother, maybe a decade before she died, standing behind the counter in her apron and laughing at something off camera. Her hands were flowery. She looked entirely like herself, the version of herself I had been trying to locate in the quieter version of her last years. Next to it, in a plain wooden frame, was a recipe card in her handwriting, the biscuit recipe, the one she had never written down anywhere that anyone knew of, except for a few pages before the USB drive in the blue cookbook she'd left to me specifically, wrapped in the fiction that it was a consolation prize. I stood there for a while. I thought about the 12-year-old version of me who had noticed a billing error in an electric statement and brought it to her kitchen table, embarrassed to have said something. I thought about the dollar bill she gave me and the words "good eyes," which I had carried without knowing I was carrying them. I thought about all the Sundays I had sat across from her in Rhonda's living room and told myself she was only quieter than usual because she was grieving, and how she had used every one of those visits to check whether I was still the kind of person who noticed things. She had not left me the restaurants. She had left me the only thing that could save them, wrapped inside something she knew I would actually open, delivered into my hands by a system she had built alone, over years, without asking for help, because the people she might have asked were either gone or were the problem. A year to the day after her funeral, the Vine Street location held a reopening dinner for about 40 people. Former staff, longtime regulars, a few neighbors who had been coming since the 1980s. Dennis had a banner made in the same hand-lettered style as the chalkboard. Opal's Kitchen, Est, 1978. My father gave a short speech. He held it together for most of it. I stood outside on the sidewalk after dinner, in the cooling April air, and looked up at the lit sign. She hadn't chosen me because I was her favorite, or because I loved her the most, or because I was the most capable person she knew. She'd chosen me because I was the one who had been paying attention when it was inconvenient. When the answer was probably nothing. When the easier thing would have been to let the question drop. She had been doing the same thing for 47 years, building something that outlasted the circumstances that should have prevented it. Noticing what everyone else was willing to overlook. She just wanted to know at the end that she wasn't the only one left who still was.